So here's a question from Lynn. We don't know where Lynn is because we can't ask you where you're at, Lynn, but we're going to take it. All right. Oh, wait. She wrote it in anyway. She says, hi from Oklahoma.
Hi, Lynn.
It's got to be an NJ because she anticipated what it was that we wanted to hear. Okay. Could you talk about being on the border of different types and specifically how circumstances like health or depression can affect how our personality looks on the outside? I'm an ENFJ, but an extreme E. I have rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, which saps my energy, so I live more like an INFJ. Since I've had them for most of my life, more INFJ qualities have developed, and I'm not as strong in the ENFJ qualities that were evident when I was younger.
You know, as a general comment before we get into specifics, this is something that I've noticed. People that are of a certain type that grow up in contexts that stretch them or push them outside of that type or what you identify as that type. For example, an INFP that grows up in a very extroverted thinking context develops themselves in a very different way than an INFP that grows up in maybe an artistic household, right? They grow up like maybe in a military family. It's gonna be a very different experience for that INFP because the way their personality is shaped and the things that they're supposed to in their family or their context focus on help develop different aspects of themselves than they would have if they were in a more natural environment for themselves. And often it's been my experience in general that a lot of people get great benefit from that. If you're a certain type and you're put into a context that doesn't just cater to your type, it doesn't cater to how you're wired, it forces you to stretch the other parts of your personality. Notice these are some amazing people that I've met. Like they weren't allowed to indulge or overindulge some of maybe the, not the bad parts of themselves, but the parts that they're indulgent around, right? Their processes, they've had to work on other coping strategies, other mechanisms and grow them. So it sounds really awful, some of the health challenges you're under, like that's not cool. Like that, I was like, ugh, maybe cringe when I heard it. And also there might be great benefit if you're an ENFJ and you're able to grow your introverted intuition co-pilot, that part of you, and you almost look like an INFJ because you were forced into it. There's amazing things that can come from that. So I think it's, in some ways I just want to honor that when you're put into a context that doesn't cater to your type, that can be very powerful for you. So don't think that's necessarily a bad thing if you're watching and you're relating to what she just said.
Yeah. Cringe with sympathy.
Cringe.
Made you cringe with sympathy.
I didn't mean cringe like,
yeah.
I gotta be careful what I say, yeah.
I know, right?
Cringe like, oh man, I felt bad. Like I felt like, oh, that sounds like a really tough experience. I meant with cringe in that way.
So the question isn't, forgive me, the question isn't super clear. It's more just sort of like a, like what does it mean when you have circumstances in your life that have required of you different elements of your personality to come out, kind of like what Joel is talking about, when the context of your life requires you to not show up as, maybe as authentically as you normally would have. I think that, so I think this is actually one of the best ways, those of us into personality typology, particularly for growth, I think that we have such a leg up on the understanding the concept of systems thinking, because when it comes to who we are as the emergent, right, the emergent of an entire system running, we recognize that our personality type in the Myers-Briggs system, so like our best fit Myers-Briggs type, is one node in the system. But then when we start adding other layers to it, like my Enneagram type, I think we try to shoehorn them in and make them the same node, but they're two totally different nodes. But then once we start realizing that there's different nodes, we're like, oh, what are the other nodes in our lives? Another node could be the family we grew up in and the influences we had. Another node is the culture we come from. Another node is our socioeconomic level. Another node is our health and how we have experienced things physically.
A gender role and all the markers outside and internal that get projected and internalized for that.
That's right, like our social programming, and then just the things that are coming up inside of us, and biology and that kind of stuff. So who we are and how we show up is the emergent of a fairly complex system running. And that is one of the reasons why when we first get into type, or a lot of us that first get into type, because we have we've been trained by life and by our schooling and basically by almost everybody in our world to think in one-to-one correlations, like cause, effect, if, then, right? And so we find a type and we read all these descriptors and we're like, well, it kind of sounds like me, but not completely, not recognizing that the descriptor cannot take into account all of the different influences in your life, all of the other nodes besides the node of that personality type. So if you have health issues, The emergent of who you are is going to show up differently if in your system one of the nodes is health issues versus somebody who maybe doesn't have those health issues, and so that node is much smaller. It's like a lot less influential to any health issues that they might have had or their relationship to health. So that's one big thing. I think what's interesting about understanding type, though, in relationship to health is also recognizing how personality types have a tendency, or the functions that we use have a tendency to relate to health in and of itself. So as an ENFJ, you might have felt like you were required to act more like an INFJ because maybe you didn't have as much opportunity to be out and about and socializing and have more of like a sort of a projected out energy, like extroverts have a tendency to have, because you've had health issues. Maybe you had to be home more often, or you had less social life, or you had to sort of have more a smaller energy around that. But at the same time, you're also going to be experiencing your health issues more with your extroverted sensing, or that sensation 10-year-old, your extroverted sensing tertiary function. So in some ways, maybe you aren't living as much like an INFJ because the amount of real estate that your health issues is taking and sort of jerking you into that 10-year-old tertiary function of extroverted sensing, where you're always having to sort of like manage your health moment to moment and manage how it's making you feel and apply all this like financial and time resource and all that into taking care of your body. That actually pulls you out of introverted intuition unless you have learned ways to specifically employ introverted intuition or perspectives into your health regime. Meaning that, are you looking for outside of the box ways of dealing with your health? Or are you just in it? Are you just feeling it and in your body experience and in the moment to moment of the health and pain? And my suspicion is that if this has been for a while, if this has been your whole life, you probably have had to create a balance between those two things. You probably did get to a point where you're like, this sucks, I don't want to feel this way anymore. What are some of the alternative ways that I can approach this? And you got more into your introverted intuition to think about things not so much in terms of just like, what does the doctor say? What are the things that I'm supposed to be doing? What is the world around me? Like, you probably got a little bit more imaginative and a little bit more experimental and a little bit more like sort of seeing health in a holistic way and how it all relates to each other and what's the meaning of all of this. Understanding that how we show up physically is like intrinsically linked to how we think and feel, and how we think and feel sometimes traumas get locked in there and then they bleed out into how we're feeling physically. So if we can heal our emotional and psychological trauma, sometimes that positively affects our bodies, and vice versa. If we get our health, our physical health, in a better position, it helps unlock emotional and psychological trauma. So you probably have done a lot of experimenting with introverted intuition or perspectives. And if you haven't, that is the thing you must be doing as an ENFJ. You need to get into more of sort of a holistic approach. I don't mean like holistic medicine, because I know that that's loaded and a lot of people have their own definitions of what that means. But I mean in more of an introverted intuition, all these things are connected, and how do I understand the implications and interpretations of all of that as they relate to each other? So what's interesting is that you wouldn't have been living as an INFJ, you would have been living as an NFJ with health problems, right? And the challenges of all of that. In some ways, INFJs have an even more difficult time because their health challenges oftentimes live in their extroverted sensing 3 or inferior, which is their blind spot. And sometimes it takes them a really long time, number 1, to even acknowledge they have health issues. Number 2, to know what to do about it. Number 3, to not just give them self-permission to hand themselves over to health challenges, but to actually proactively use introverted intuition to really help solve this, as opposed to like kind of letting themselves, letting themselves escape to a more introverted space, right? And having health issues be the reason why they can't go out of their house as much. So actually, as an ENFJ, I wouldn't say that you've been living more as an INFJ. I would say that you've been living as an ENFJ with health issues. So yeah, I think it can, to the outside world, if they don't know any better and they don't know what they're doing with diagnostic, it could appear to them that you're more introverted simply because they have a stereotype in their head about what an extrovert is supposed to look like and how they're supposed to show up. But I would say, as somebody who understands the differences, and I don't mean me, I mean in the camp of people who recognize that type can come in all these different flavors, I would say you probably are showing up like an ENFJ with health issues. And that's just one of the nodes in the system that makes up you and who you are as the emergent. But yeah, if you haven't already, you employ introverted intuition or perspectives, employ that in your strategy for addressing your health, and recognize that the mind-body connection is like this, not these two things that talk to each other, but they're sort of intrinsically linked, and the health of one directly relates to the health of the other. But you probably already have that down. So
yeah, thank you very much for the question.